Have you ever felt like you know exactly what you should be doing, but you're just not doing it? You've read the books, you've watched the trainings, you've probably even mapped out what your business could look like, and yet you hesitate, you overthink, you start and then stop. And there's this quiet, frustrating gap between what you know you're capable of and what you're actually doing. And if you're honest with yourself, there's probably a story that comes with that. It sounds something like, why is this so hard for me? Maybe I'm not cut out for this. I should be further along by now. And over time, the story starts to feel true. You start to question yourself, your ability, your readiness, and you're saying to yourself something like, what is wrong with me? Hi, I'm Jenny, and this is my weekly expert procrastination and empowerment talk. And this week's talk is the invisible transition from employee identity to entrepreneur identity. So, what if the question you've been asking yourself is the wrong question? What if nothing has gone wrong? And this might feel hard because you're in the middle of something you can't yet see. Because here's what I see over and over again. The women I work with are not lacking in ability. They are intelligent, capable, experienced. They've built careers. They solve problems. They show up for other people every single day. So if they can do all of that, why does starting their own business feel so hard? It doesn't make sense if this is just about strategy. So let me offer you a different perspective. You're not stuck because you don't know what to do. You're stuck because you're becoming someone new. You're moving from one identity into another. From someone who has spent years operating in one way, being rewarded for certain behaviours, feeling safe in a certain type of structure, into a completely different way of being. And no one ever told you that this part would feel like this uncertainty, this hesitation, this feeling of being in between. And it's not failure, it's transition. So if this is transition, then the next question becomes, what are you actually transitioning from? Because before you can fully step into who you are becoming, you need to understand who you've been trained to be. The patterns, the behaviours, the beliefs that have helped you succeed up until now. So let's look at the identity you've been operating from and why it no longer fully supports where you want to go. So let's start here. If this feels like a transition, then we need to understand what you're transitioning from, because the way you've been operating up until now hasn't been random. It's been shaped over years through school, through work, through the environments you've been a part of. You've been trained into a very specific way of thinking, working, and showing up. And we can call this the employee identity. Now, I want to be really clear. There is nothing wrong with this identity. In fact, it's probably the reason you've been successful. It's helped you build your career, be seen as capable, be trusted by others, and to deliver results. But it was designed for a very specific system. A system where there are clear expectations, there are defined roles, there is structure, there is feedback, and there is validation. And within that system, you learned how to succeed. You learned things like follow the rules, do what's expected, get it right, be reliable, be consistent, and most particularly, don't make mistakes. And often, without even realizing it, you also learned don't speak up unless you're sure, don't draw too much attention to yourself, wait until you're ready, wait until someone tells you it's good enough. And in that environment, safety comes from certainty, structure, and external validation. And your subconscious learned, if I do this well, I'll be safe. Now, you may not have been consciously aware of that thought, but that's what's been running through your subconscious, because your subconscious is primarily focused on being safe. So what does that look like now as you're trying to build a business of your own? It often shows up as wanting clear steps before you begin, waiting until you feel fully ready, looking for validation before you act, wanting to get it right the first time. And it can also show up as constantly doing new certificates and training because you're wanting to find the right way of doing things. Now, it can show up as overthinking, perfectionism, procrastination, and doubting yourself. And it's not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're using an identity that was designed for a completely different environment. You were trained to succeed in a system where you were guided, you were evaluated, you were told what was good enough. But now you're stepping into a space where you decide, you lead, and you define what is good enough. And that is a completely different way of operating. So of course this feels unfamiliar. Of course it feels uncomfortable. Of course there's hesitation, because part of you is still operating from the identity that kept you safe before. And this is where things start to make sense, because what's happening right now is not that you don't know what to do, it's that two different ways of being are colliding. On the one hand, you have the identity that helped you succeed as an employee. And on the other, you have the version of you that's trying to build something new. And those two don't operate the same way. So you end up in this in-between space where part of you wants to move forward and part of you is trying to keep you in what feels familiar and safe. And that's the clash. But once you see it, you stop making it mean something about you and you start understanding what's really going on. So let's take a closer look at that internal conflict and why it's the reason you feel stuck. So now that we've looked at the identity you've been trained into, let's talk about what happens when you try to build a business from that place. Because this is where the experience you're having starts to make sense. Right now, you're not operating from one identity. You're operating from two. On one side, you have the employee identity, the part of you that wants clarity before action and wants to get things right, looks for validation, avoids risk, and feels safer staying behind the scenes. And on the other hand, you have something else emerging, the part of you that wants more freedom, wants to create something of your own, wants to be seen, heard, and valued, and knows you are capable of more. And these two parts don't operate in the same way. In fact, they often want opposite things. So what you experience is this an internal tug of war. One part of you is saying, let's go, it's time, we can do this. And another part of you is saying, wait, this doesn't feel safe, we don't have enough certainty yet. And when those two are pulling in different directions, you don't move forward. You get stuck. And this is where procrastination, overthinking, and self-doubt show up. Not as personal flaws, but as a result of this clash. So how this clash shows up in moments like this is you sit down to post something, for instance, and suddenly you're thinking, what if this isn't good enough? What if people judge me? What if I say the wrong thing and all of the people, potential customers, run away? So you don't post. Or you sit down to create an offer and think, I need to be clearer first. I should probably learn more. I'm not ready yet. So you delay. Or you consider putting yourself out there and feel, oh my God, this is so uncomfortable. This feels so exposing. So you pull back. And each time one of these things happens, it reinforces the feeling that you're stuck. But you're not actually stuck. You're in conflict. So the real insight here is that you're trying to build a business using an identity that was designed to keep you safe in a job. An identity that says, wait until you're ready. Don't take unnecessary risks. Make sure you get it right. But entrepreneurship requires something very different. It requires taking action without certainty, being visible before you feel ready, making decisions without validation, being seen and potentially judged. So of course this feels uncomfortable. Of course there's resistance, because part of you is stepping into something new, while another part is trying to keep you in what feels safe and familiar. And this is the moment where so many people misinterpret what's happening. They think, this means I'm not cut out for this. But that's not what this means. What it actually means is you're in the middle of a shift. And that shift isn't just about what you're doing, it's about who you're becoming. Because if one part of you is holding on to the familiar, there's another part of you that's trying to move forward. A different way of thinking, a different way of showing up, a different identity that's starting to emerge. And the more you understand that identity, the easier it becomes to move toward it. Not by forcing yourself, but by gradually stepping into it. So let's look at who you're actually becoming and what this next version of you really looks like. So if part of what's been happening is that you've been operating from an identity that no longer fully supports where you want to go, then the next question is, who are you actually becoming? Because this isn't just about starting a business. It's about stepping into a completely different way of thinking, deciding, and showing up. And I want to say this clearly. You don't become an entrepreneur the moment you register a business or create an offer. You become an entrepreneur through how you operate, through how you make decisions, through how you respond to uncertainty, through how you show up when things feel uncomfortable. Entrepreneurship is not just something you do. It's an identity you grow into. So let's look at the first part of this, which is self-leadership. So in a job, you're guided. Even if you've been promoted upwards to managerial levels, there's still always someone above you who is guiding you in what you need to be doing and thinking and saying. There are expectations. there are deadlines, there are people, as I said, telling you what matters most. But as an entrepreneur, you lead yourself. You decide what to focus on, what actions to take, what direction to move in. And that can feel very uncomfortable at first, because every day you start the day trying to think of, what should I be doing today? And there's no one above you saying, well, today you're going to be doing this. It's you having to look at the array of things you need to accomplish, and there's quite often a lot of them, and you need to find your pathway through and make decisions about, this is what I'm going to do now, this is what I'm going to do next. And it can feel really uncomfortable at first, because you're no longer waiting to be told you're doing it right. You're deciding that for yourself. So the second thing is safe visibility. In the employee identity, you could succeed without being highly visible. You might have craved visibility, and you might have craved getting acknowledgement for what you've done. But you could be competent, reliable, and behind the scenes and still be successful. But in business, visibility matters. People need to hear you, see you, and understand what you offer. And that doesn't mean becoming someone loud or performative. It means becoming someone who is willing to be seen, even before it feels completely comfortable. So the third thing is self-trust. And this is often a big shift that you're not necessarily aware of. Because in your previous environment, validation came from outside of you. Now you have to trust your own decisions. You choose your direction, you decide what's good enough. Sorry. You take action without knowing exactly how it will turn out. And that requires a different kind of confidence. Not certainty, but trust. And often we've lost our self-trust. And for some people, it's like many, many years or decades even when they did lose their self-trust. And you haven't noticed it along the way, apart from moments of self-judgment when you're criticizing yourself for making a decision and not following through. But it's something that hasn't necessarily been obvious as an employee, because you've got someone else judging you and deciding, and you're following along that pathway and not necessarily having to trust your own decisions. So the next thing is emotional resilience. And as an entrepreneur, you will experience things that you could avoid in a job, like silence when you share something, people not responding, people saying no, people disagreeing. And the goal isn't to avoid those things. It's to be able to handle them, to stay grounded, even when things don't go the way you hoped. And you've got to be able to learn to do this, because you have to keep putting things out there. You have to keep exposing yourself to the world. And you do feel exposed because that's exactly what you're doing. And you do have to be able to deal with judgment, because there will be judgment. There will most likely be trolls who are just being negative and not quite outright nasty. There will be people who disagree with you or suggest that you don't know what you're talking about. And you need to be ready for that. You need to be able to cope with that, because it will be there. So the next thing is imperfect action. And this was particularly difficult for me. In the employee identity, getting things right mattered. And I spent a lot of my time checking my work, particularly when I was building complicated spreadsheets. I was mortally terrified of making mistakes. And I would check stuff over and over again to stop other people from finding any mistakes that might be there. But in entrepreneurship, progress matters more than perfection. You don't wait until everything is perfect. You try, learn, adjust, and improve. And you do that pattern over and over again. You have to accept, and it can be very difficult, you have to accept that you put stuff out there and it won't necessarily work the way you think it should have. And it's not necessarily because it's wrong. It's not necessarily that there's a mistake. It's just that it's not working. It's not right. And it takes a little bit to get used to that you do need to keep testing stuff. And it is a continuing process. And I want you to notice something here, that every single one of these traits that I've talked about is likely to feel very uncomfortable at first. And it's not because they're wrong for you. It's just that they're new. So you don't become this version of yourself before you take action. You become this version of yourself through taking action. Small actions, imperfect actions, repeated actions that gradually shift how you see yourself and what feels normal. So if part of you is thinking, I'm not there yet, that's okay, because this isn't a switch that you flip. It's not an instant change. It's something that you step into over time. And this is where we come to something really important, because there's a phase in this process that almost nobody talks about. The part where you're no longer fully operating from your old identity, but you don't yet feel fully comfortable in the new one. And this is the space where most people start to really doubt themselves. They're thinking things like, this shouldn't feel this hard, and maybe I'm not cut out for this. But what's actually happening is that you're in the middle of the transition, and that's why it feels the way it does. So let's take a closer look at that phase and why it's where so many people get stuck. So let's talk about the part of this process that almost nobody prepares you for. The part that feels the most confusing, the most uncomfortable, and the most uncertain, the in-between phase. And this is the space where you're no longer fully operating from your old identity, but you don't yet feel like the new version of yourself. You're not fully the employee anymore, but you don't feel like an entrepreneur either. And even at this point, you might still feel very uncomfortable actually using the word entrepreneur. I know it took me a long, long time before I could think of myself as an entrepreneur. And this whole phase that you're going through can feel very unsettling because you lose your sense of certainty. The old way doesn't quite fit anymore, but the new way doesn't feel natural either yet. So you end up in this space where you know more than you used to. You definitely want something different, but you don't feel fully confident acting on it. And that's where doubt creeps in. And you might be having thoughts like, why is this still so hard? I should be further along by now. I can't even tell you how many times I've thought that. But you might also be saying, maybe I'm not cut out for this. And this is the moment where so many people turn back. And not because they can't do it, but because they misinterpret what this phrase means. Phase, not phrase, phase. So what's actually happening is that your identity is shifting. And identity, as I said before, doesn't change instantly. It changes through repetition, through experience, and through evidence. So right now, you're practicing being someone new, but your subconscious is still familiar with the old patterns, which means the old thoughts still show up, the old habits still run, the old fears still activate. And even as you're trying to do things differently, it's all of this still keeps showing up. And there might even be a period like once I started to become confident doing these talks, I'd feel more and more confident. And then all of a sudden, my subconscious would be throwing out all these doubts again, even though I was, beginning to trust myself and think that I was okay doing these things. The subconscious is just test driving whether it's all actually true and working. So your experience of this phase often looks like you take a step forward and then you pull back. You feel motivated and then you doubt yourself. You make progress and then you question everything. And it can feel like you're going backwards, but you're not. You're just moving between the two identities. So this discomfort you're feeling is not a sign that something has gone wrong. And that's what most people think. It feels like because it's not comfortable, because it's so you're so uneasy, it feels like something is wrong. But it's really a sign that something is changing. Because if you were completely comfortable, you'd still be operating from your old identity and nothing would be different. So the fact that this feels unfamiliar or uncertain or even uncomfortable is actually evidence that the shift is happening. So the mistake most people make here is expecting themselves to feel like the new version of themselves before they've actually become it. And they might be thinking things like, I'll show up when I feel confident. I'll take action when this feels easier. But that's not how identity works. You don't feel like the new version first. You become the new version by acting before it feels natural. And that doesn't mean forcing yourself. It means allowing it to feel a little unfamiliar while still taking small steps forward. So if this phase is normal, if this discomfort is part of the process, then the real question becomes, how do you move through it without getting stuck here? How do you keep moving forward without overwhelming yourself, without burning out, and without slipping back into the old patterns? Because there is a way to navigate this transition that feels supportive, sustainable, and actually doable. And it's not about pushing harder. It's about learning how to move through this shift safely. So let's look at how to do that. So now that you understand that this is an in-between phase and it's normal, and that the discomfort is part of the shift, the question becomes, how do you actually move through it without getting stuck here? Because this isn't about pushing yourself to become someone new overnight. It's about allowing yourself to grow into that identity in a way that your system can actually support. So let me walk you through a few simple shifts that will help you move through this transition safely. The first step is recognize the phase you're in. So this first step is about awareness. Instead of saying, I'm stuck, you start saying, I'm in a transition. And that one shift alone changes how you interpret everything. Because now, when doubt shows up, When things feel uncomfortable, you don't make it mean that something is wrong. You understand this is part of the process. And that reduces the pressure immediately. So the second step is expect discomfort without making it mean stop. So the second shift is this: stop expecting this to feel comfortable. Because growth, especially identity level growth, will feel unfamiliar. It will feel uncertain, awkward, and a little uncomfortable. And that is not a sign to stop. It's a sign that you're stepping into something new. So instead of asking, why does this feel so hard? Ask instead, can I keep going even though this feels new? And the third step is take identity-based action. And this is where things really begin to shift. Instead of waiting to feel like the entrepreneur, you start asking yourself, what would the next level version of me do here? Not in a big, overwhelming way. Don't allow your subconscious to push you out too far and then you stumble and come back to procrastination and overthinking. So take small, grounded steps. For example, you might share something even if it's not perfect. You might make a decision without overthinking it, just a small decision. You might take one small action instead of waiting. And every time you do that, you close the gap between who you've been and who you're becoming. So the fourth step is build evidence through small wins. Confidence doesn't come from thinking. Even no matter how hard you try to make it happen, it just doesn't. Instead, it comes from evidence. So rather than trying to feel confident first, you create small wins. Moments where you show up, follow through, do something slightly outside your comfort zone, just a teeny tiny amount outside there. And each time you do that, you show your subconscious this is safe enough to keep doing. And that's the crucial point. And that's why it needs to be a tiny step, because your subconscious will try and make you take a leap so that you feel too uncomfortable, it's too painful. So if you take a tiny step, you get that little bit of evidence. And your subconscious may still say, oh my God, that's too small a step. It's quite happy to judge you at any point, anything you do. But if you can ignore that and be ready for it to say things like that, and you keep taking small steps, the little steps build up into a pathway of action. And each step in that pathway gives you evidence and gives your subconscious evidence that it is safe to be taking those actions. And that's how identity changes. Not in one big leap, but through repeated supported actions. And step 5 is reduce the gap. Make it feel safer. So finally, you don't jump from where you are to the fully confident version of you, because it won't happen. You take too large a leap, you self-sabotage, you come back to procrastination. But if you can bridge the gap, you make things feel safer step by step. So that might look like sharing something small before something bigger. Practicing being visible in lower risk ways. So for instance, if you're in a mentoring group, doing live in the Facebook group for that mentor group, because you're more likely to be in a safe, supported zone there where people will, encourage you and congratulate you on taking that step, rather than starting with doing lives in your Facebook personal page, which is it's a big step to take the first time you do it, or maybe even the first few times you do it. So make sure you're taking action in environments that feel supportive. You don't need to leap out to the unsupportive environments at the start. Practice in a supported environment first so that you build your confidence. And then when you go out into the less supportive environments where you eventually need to go, then you've got that little bit of confidence to keep you going, and it's easier to deal with any negativity that we may experience out there. And the goal is not to force yourself into discomfort. It's to expand your capacity gradually so that what once felt uncomfortable becomes normal. So now I want you to take a moment and I want you to ask yourself, and I will repeat both of these questions. So the first one is, where have I been telling myself I'm stuck when I'm actually transitioning? So where have I been telling myself I'm stuck when I'm actually transitioning? And the next question is, what would the next version of me do in one small way this week? So what would the next version of me do in one small way this week? You don't need to change everything. Just one step is enough to move you forward. And when your subconscious is being difficult and saying, oh my God, that step's not big enough, that's not enough, you just need to be able to ready to say, at least I've taken one step, rather than procrastinating for how long you've been procrastinating. How many steps did you take in that period you were procrastinating? This one small step, it's movement, and you need to acknowledge that. So as you begin to take these steps, something deeper starts to shift inside you, because you're no longer trying to force yourself into becoming something different. You're allowing yourself to grow into who you're becoming. And that changes everything. Because this isn't just about starting a business. It's about becoming the person who can build it. So let's bring this all together and look at the identity shift that's been happening all the way through this journey. So before we finish, I want you to take a moment and just notice what's shifted for you. Because you didn't just sit here and learn something. You recognized something. And maybe it was for the first time. You saw that what you've been experiencing isn't because you're not capable. It's not because you're behind. And it's not because you don't have what it takes. It's because you've been in the middle of something that most people don't even realize is happening. An identity shift. You've been moving from one way of being into another. From someone who was trained to follow structure, seek validation, get things right, and stay safe. And you're moving into someone who is learning to lead herself, make decisions, be visible, and trust your own voice. And it doesn't happen instantly. It happens in moments, in small decisions, in the way you respond when things feel uncertain. So you're no longer the person who is not ready, who is stuck, or who is inconsistent. You are someone who is in the process of becoming, and you're becoming someone who can take action without certainty. Show up before it feels comfortable. Trust yourself even when it's new. And that version of you is already there. You're not creating her from scratch. You're learning how to access her. So I want to leave you with one question. What would it look like to trust that you're already on the path, even when it doesn't feel clear? Because when you stop making this transition mean something has gone wrong, you free up so much energy to actually move forward. And an important thing about everything you've gone through in the time that you've been procrastinating, and from my time of procrastinating, I have learned so much. And I use all of those experiences as examples to share. And that's something that you can do as well. Even while you're still feeling uncomfortable, you can talk about feeling uncomfortable. You can share that you are feeling uncomfortable. If you can feel that, if you can be that vulnerable, you can share the difficulties you've had, because you will find that that will inspire people and, in fact, draw people to you. And yes, there may be people out there who are criticizing you for feeling uncomfortable and may even have people telling you to give up, but you can draw people to you who need your assistance by sharing those uncomfortable experiences. And so if you're listening to this and something in you is thinking, this makes so much sense, but I don't want to navigate this alone, that is exactly the work I do. I support women who are in this exact transition from employee to entrepreneur to move through this phase with clarity, with confidence, and a way of taking action that actually feels sustainable. Not by pushing harder, but by working with what's really happening underneath. So if you're ready to take that next step, I'd love you to invite you to join me in my online course, The Courageous Pathway, where we take everything we've talked about today and apply it to your real life and your patterns and the actions you've been taking, which have been holding you back. So this doesn't just stay as something you understand, it becomes something you live. But there's no pressure, it's just an opportunity if you're interested. And this hopefully will help you move through this transition with my support. So finally, nothing has gone wrong with you. You're not behind. You're in the middle of becoming someone new. And you get to decide what comes next. Thank you for being here today. And I hope you got a lot out of this.